Hey everyone!
Long time no see!
Although I figure most of you here are first-time viewers, as my first upload was more of a niche passion project in order to kind of re-establish myself back onto the platform into the Sonic tuber scene. Projects like this, however, were always intended to be the real meat and potatoes of the channel, with fun, quick videos like the Halloween special thrown in for variety's sake. But enough about my questionable upload practices. Today, I'd like to take a good hard look at Sonic Frontiers. Now, this is a game that is very special to me, and that's not to say its story made me bawl my eyes out. However, one scene sure did make me feel a strong emotion, but not the one I think was intended, nor did its gameplay make me reevaluate how games should be from now on. No, this game is special to me because of what it means for Sonic as a whole. There's few, if any, Sonic games I can remember with the pressure on it this game had, and now, this might be due to myself having much more involvement with the game's release and development than past titles, but I believe it's more than that. See, after a rocky first look in June, this game quickly developed the expectation of being the savior of Sonic games, and as more fans fizzled out on the boost formula on top of Force's overall negative reception, and well, outside of the comics and movies, the future of Sonic looked pretty bleak. But as we learn more about this new generation of Sonic and what it had in store for us, hype grew really fast. Every update on the game was met with a slew of theories and hype posts gassing up the game to astronomical heights, and because of these, I struggled to keep my expectations reasonable, while maintaining high hopes and trying my best to tune out claims of the game being peak fiction or game of the year, because at the end of the day, it is still a Sonic game, and while Sonic may be possibly my favorite intellectual property, I knew what to expect from his video game outings. So when that faithful day finally came, and I saw those 7s appear across the board, I knew I was right to keep my expectations reasonable. But hey, a 7 is like a 10 to Sonic fans, am I right? Regardless, I figured it best to let the hype die down and properly give this game some proper time to, digest and really gather my thoughts about it so I could adequately assess the game as a whole. So without further rambling, I'd like to share my thoughts on Sonic Frontiers, a game that came so close, yet so far. See, right off the bat, Frontiers does its best to ease players in with a familiar intro, although with a slightly more serious tone, showcasing how Eggman fits into the plot this time. Followed by a very lighthearted introduction to 3 out of the 4 members of our main cast. I do really appreciate the title drop in this game, as it does a great job at feeling like the next step for Sonic, on top of the overall vibes that the developers were rather proud of what they had done here, which was really nice to see. I'm not gonna lie, I felt so refreshed going into this game after seeing how they were choosing to present it. Following that pleasant title drop, however, we go right back into the more serious tone, with Sonic and friends also getting sucked into cyberspace, with Knuckles getting abducted in the prologue, which is a fantastic watch. I really suggest you do if you haven't yet. We start the game with a traditional cyberspace stage, which I'll get more into later, before being dumped onto Kronos Island, where the game truly begins. I remember feeling incredibly slow during the first cyberspace stage, although this was partly due to me learning the controls, and when you do, the set speed in cyberspace becomes much more tolerable. But this feeling is immediately translated into the open zone gameplay, and unfortunately this is kind of a problem that never really goes away. Sonic just kind of feels slower in this game than in previous, which isn't always inherently a bad thing, especially for people who are new to the game, which I assume is a good chunk, considering this game's exponentially higher sales from Forces. But as I continued playing, I found myself constantly having to pause in order to fill my rings in order to toggle the power boost so that I could be in a more enjoyable speed. Because other than a few specific overworld minigames, accuracy is not my top concern in a game about going fast and having fun. Hell, fully upgrading my ring capacity is the only achievement I didn't unlock because I didn't want to have to wait longer to turn on power boost if I ever were to lose my rings to a mini boss or hazard. This, in turn, brings me to the boost gauge, which I think was a completely unnecessary addition, even when it comes to the cyberspace stages where having limited boost makes sense, as it's always been a feature in the games. However, in Frontier's case, the cyberspace stages are all too short for the boost gauge to ever actually really be an obstacle, so when it comes to the open zone, when you are boosting for longer periods of time, it's really annoying to have to pause every 20 seconds. Yeah, winning counted. Regardless, I think the use of a limited amount of boost, no matter how fast it recharges, is ultimately a detriment to exploration, as well as keeping the metaphorical momentum going. Speaking of momentum, this game kind of has it, or at least the little speed gauge in the bottom right corner wants you to think it does. No matter how fast you're actually going, your jump is essentially a scripted event with only marginal at best differences in length depending on whether or not you're boosting. Small gaps that absolutely should be clearable based off the speed you're going just aren't, because when you jump, any momentum you were carrying is dropped and you jump just as far and high as you would have as if you had just started going. While this weak jump can easily be remedied by the air dash, it would have been a lot cooler if I could jump, keep my speed going, and then add an air dash on top of that for even more distance and aerial maneuvers. Sonic also feels weirdly magnetized to the ground here, which definitely feels very strange, especially when going up slopes, almost as if Sonic is one of those cars on a conveyor belt toys, you know, you had as a kid. Trust me, if you know what I'm talking about, this is a really cool analogy. I wanted to bring this up because it can be very jarring at times as Sonic will shift nearly 90 degrees just to stick to the ground. However, this magnetism property only applies to the actual ground, so if for some reason you trip on a rock or anything that isn't ground, the game gets a little confused and 9 times out of 10 will just shoot you off into the atmosphere. But it's okay because Sonic does a cool little front flip and then the game acts as if you went on a trick ramp and lets you trick out until you hit the ground, which, if this was on purpose, great way of solving a problem without actually solving it, Sonic Team. These annoyances, however, have no real effect on how Sonic controls, which is nothing short of amazing. Inputs feel snappy and responsive, although on rare occasion the game will eat an input or two, but this is indicative of a larger problem with the open zone I'll get into later. One of the biggest complaints I heard about the game from people was annoyances with how the camera controls, claiming to be fighting with it at every turn and just really struggling in general. I, however, had the complete opposite experience. I don't know about you guys, but I found the camera incredibly intuitive and easy to keep where you wanted, aside from moments of interest that steal the camera or this fucking balloon guy, but these are mostly non-issues as this can be toggled in the game menu. I personally found every aspect of the controls pretty damn good for an open world platformer, from how they operated to their button mapping. Speaking of button mapping, the controls here are slightly tweaked from previous entries, most notably the boost button moving from X, Y, or square depending on your platform to now being mapped to the trigger, which I personally think is a very welcome change, even if I might have slightly worn out my trigger trying to speedrun Cyberspace stages, but I really can only blame myself for that. This decision also leaves more room for other actions, namely the second biggest aspect of this game, the combat, which is great. It's fairly simple, but it's pretty great. So great, in fact, I worry it's another Cappy from Odyssey situation in which a game's added mechanic / gimmick is so good, it's hard to imagine another entry without it, not to mention wanting to see that mechanic grow and get better with every entry. On top of these two franchises moving towards their own unique brands of open world, this phenomenon has become a trend recently in big episodic franchises, most notably being Zelda, Mario, and now Sonic, you know, the standard trio, even if Frontiers doesn't want you to think it's an open world game and instead of open zone. Zelda has already cemented a new entry utilizing its open world mechanic, with it now being a safe bet for Mario and Sonic to follow suit as well, on top of most likely seeing their respective newest gameplay gimmick returned, those being Cappy and Mario and Sonic's new combat system. Tangent aside, let's get back to combat. So, long story short, in between games, Sonic became a big boy with a big boy voice and also a shonen protagonist. With this comes an honestly impressive and fun moveset, full of visually interesting and unique attacks. While the combat is certainly engaging, it is still pretty simple. Combat essentially boils down to either side looping, pressing triangle and circle, or chaining a combo after pressing right trigger and then pressing one of the 4 main buttons to trigger a special move. So while not super in depth, the attacks are so flashy and fun to chain that I can't say I ever got bored of the combat in the roughly 15 hours it took me to beat the game, but I could see it becoming boring if they plan on continuing this concept without, you know, broadening it somehow. Oh, and I nearly forgot the parry. Although it's more of a block button with timing so lenient you'd think the devs might have accidentally put a decimal in the wrong spot. Regardless, with a bigger margin for error on the parry and a little depth added into the combat system, they could certainly keep it fresh moving forward. On the topic of keeping things fresh, let's talk more about Frontier's main selling point, the open zone. Now, I do enjoy this concept. Putting Sonic in an open world to run around in was obviously a no-brainer, especially after the surge of open world platformers. However, I think that even after 5 years of development, Sonic Team still struggled a bit with how to make open zone a fully fledged idea. Evidence of this is scattered throughout the game, with Eggman only referencing 3 islands in Egg Memo 7. This becomes even more evident if you venture off the beaten path on Rhea Island, only to find Kronos locked behind an invisible wall. Actually, off the beaten path is kind of a strong term. You can see the floating inverted pyramid from Kronos right when you spawn, basically. This problem also occurs with Arenos, which has a very similar aesthetic to Kronos and Rhea, while Ares and Chaos are much more their own thing. These island aesthetics bring me to my next point, however, however, there were multiple points in this game where I could hardly tell I was playing a Sonic game. And I think that one thing that Sonic Team missed the mark on with Frontiers is making it feel like a game that could only feature Sonic, which is what you would want from an episodic series centered around your titular character. And that's not to say Sonic hasn't done shit like this before, although style changes are typically reserved for final bosses in order to really make them stand out as final threats, so I'll give them a pass. See, if I were to look at any island from Frontiers separated from the Sonic assets thrown in, without playing the game first, I'd guess it was from Xenoblade or some sort of fantasy open world knockoff. Hell, while writing this I've had to keep Frontiers open in case I need a refresher on island names, specifically between Rhea, Kronos, and Arenos, because they aren't nearly as memorable as zones like Studiopolis or Seaside Hill, which are part of games with twice the amount of environments Frontiers has. Ultimately, all 5 islands boil down to either Desert Island, Volcano Island, or 3 different flavors of green. See, if I'd come up to you and asked you what you thought a desert, volcano, and 3 types of greenery-related islands would look like, chances are you'd come up with something pretty damn close to what's already in the game. And sure, there are cool things to be seen on these islands, like the Crystal Cave and Oasis on Ares, but the most excited I got about anything thrown onto these islands was the fucking Forces robot on Chaos, because it actually really felt like Sonic for a second. And yes, there are of course the mess of rails, platforms, jump pads, and zip lines covering all 5 islands, and while they're fun to use, they ultimately feel thrown in to make the game feel more Sonic, and with the exception of Ares and a few parts of Arenos, these elements aren't well connected. They're just small platforming sections to keep you entertained and give you a memory token, and while not a problem in my playthrough on the PS5, I've talked to a few friends who played the game on other platforms and complained heavily about the camera triggers and the platforming sections not working properly, making the camera 3D in a section that's supposed to be 2D and vice versa. However, I found the camera doing what it should 99% of the time, but there still was the added threat of accidentally running over a boost pad and getting stuck in a parkour section for the next 2 minutes. But don't get me wrong, these puzzles make getting that token that much more satisfying, but it would be infinitely more entertaining if I could transfer to at least one other platforming section without having to touch the ground again after collecting said token. That's not to say that these jumping sections are inherently bad either, I just wish that they had felt more thought out and were in an environment that felt like they belonged instead of just being purple now. It's a real shame too, because this game is still incredibly fun most of the time, and that's really what ends up holding the whole experience together is just how much fun it is. Moving around feels great for the most part, platforming is awesome, combat is incredible, however, the presentation on these aspects ultimately come across as good ideas, but half-baked ones that couldn't exactly find out how they fit together tightly. This problem continues to show itself with the mini-bosses, and while they are fun distractions and tend to be pretty interesting on a first try, I never want to end up dealing with the second one and just go get the Cyberspace cog elsewhere, as every mini-boss except for the large set-piece ones like Ashura and Strider have a doppelganger hiding somewhere around their respective island. These mini-bosses just kind of feel like they're there, with the exception of this caterpillar who was hiding in a cave, so I felt like I had invaded and earned the fight, as well as this fortress who was guarding a cyberspace portal. It feels like they were supposed to be there and I earned the fight by testing them or stepping on their land, instead of just running into one randomly scattered on an island. Ultimately, all the islands just end up feeling like settings with a satisfying amount of things in them, but not a lot of purpose to those things. I'd really like to see Sonic Team expand upon the ideas, activities, and gameplay showcased in Frontiers, but just with a little more focus and purpose to those elements. And I think one of the easiest fixes to this problem is just changing the setting. As cool and mysterious as the Starfall Islands are, they just don't really lend themselves to Sonic that well. And on top of that, even their purely Starfall Island exclusive elements such as the puzzles and mini-bosses, while they do fit the aesthetic of the Starfall Islands, except for the pinball machine, but that's neither here nor there, those elements end up feeling like they were put onto the island without much purpose besides being obstacles for Sonic and dropping cyberspace gears and tokens. I think a game like Frontiers would be infinitely better in a more unique and Sonic-like setting. For example, imagine an open-world Sonic game that takes place in the Forces universe. Now, hold on, wait, please. So, like, imagine running around a fully open zone metropolis or mystic jungle with Frontiers-like platforming sections to get you from building to building and traverse instead of just being used to nab a token. Like, what if each mini-boss was a quest or tip given by Amy at HQ or another member of the cast, and that mini-boss had plot relevance, or they were oppressing a resistance settlement that you could use for resources once you defeated them, instead of just standing around in a field like in Frontiers. I really do like these elements that Frontiers introduced, even if I am being hard on them. I think they're really good first steps towards something incredible, and I just just want Sonic Team to actually stick with an idea for once, instead of scrapping it at the first sound of criticism, because I really do think they have a winning formula here. They just need to tweak some things. One thing that could certainly use a little tweaking is Cyberspace. Now, Cyberspace, of course, is supposed to be that familiar Sonic formula that we all know, and some of us love. These levels certainly feel familiar, apart from the fact that 3 out of the disappointingly small 4 level themes were lifted from other Sonic games, and a good chunk of level layouts have been generously inspired by previous Sonic ROMs. It also feels quite different. Cyberspace is an odd beast, and I think its enjoyment comes very heavily from what you as the player make of it, and while playing through the main campaign, you'll likely find yourself playing these stages once or twice in order to complete all the fairly easy challenges to get your vault key, and then move on. As the Cyberspace stages themselves do a fine job with stripped down 3-lane stages with not very hidden red rings, the most dumbed down boost mechanic in a Sonic game, and for the most part, more than generous S-rank times. All of this said, however, the stages really open up once you beat the game and can easily play them back to back, racing for the best time in a vacuum, and that simplistic boost really comes in handy to help you with maneuvering. Not to mention the homing boost, which was a exploit found very quickly after the release of the game, which has made Cyberspace about 10 times more fun. To be honest, some of my best memories from playing Frontiers came from speedrunning Cyberspace stages in arcade mode, sitting around with my friends and slowly whittling down that time the lowest I could. And like I said before, Sonic's slowness carries over to Cyberspace. However, I feel it tends to keep you more dialed in and less floaty at times. Frontiers' Cyberspace certainly isn't for everyone, and I know that some people really don't like it, but I'm not gonna lie and say I hated it when it provided me with some real solid value to Frontiers' postgame. Before we wrap up the gameplay segment, there's one more aspect of the Frontiers formula they absolutely nailed. Now, I'm sure this topic needs no introduction, but of course, I am talking about the absolutely kick-ass boss fights. This shit right here is why I'm being so hard on Sonic Team for their presentation, because they show us at least 5 goddamn times that they know how to present a threat. The bosses are immediately built up as these insane threats too strong for Sonic to fight on his own. This being very clearly shown after the first Titan Giganto chucks Sonic fucking Yankee Stadium Hall of Famer style through 2 pillars into a goddamn mountain. The fight itself being revealed to be on a waterfall in a perfect arena-sized crater consisting of a pretty standard first boss in order to teach you the ropes on Super Sonic, who controls pretty similarly to normal Sonic, except for now flying and using rings to survive. The parry is definitely your best friend here, which will allow you to get some easy solid hits in, whittling him down until finishing him off by flying through him, causing him to explode and completely vaporize himself in one of the coolest boss fight scenes in all of Sonic. Then when you make your way over to Ares, you'll be introduced to the Wyvern, which flies around watching Ares on a loop, almost always in view. This fight taking place entirely in the sky, in which you've got to catch up before swinging the Wyvern around like a children's toy and just chucking him into a mountain in order to do damage. Not to mention, this fight has, in my opinion, the absolute best boss theme in all of Sonic history. So as we make our way to Chaos Island, we're instantly met with a bit of a mood change, as there's no immediate threat shown to us as we show up, and instead you just kind of have to put together what you think this new Titan is going to look like, but you know he's around somewhere. Then he finally pops up after you get the 6th Chaos Emerald and talk to Sage, only to find he was hiding in a lava pit this whole time. This fight was my least favorite next to the penultimate boss Supreme, as his admittedly very cool action set piece of riding his saw blade shield back into him to do damage became a bit of a chore, getting so aggressively knocked around by unavoidable rockets. The final Titan, Supreme, who we learn about on Rhea, just sort of shows up to start the climax after getting all 7 emeralds on Aranos, and to be honest, he's a bit of a cakewalk. In my experience at least, I was able to whittle his health bar down so low that he stopped losing health because he needed to initiate the next part of the fight, and that one didn't last much longer. Then finally we have the End, who I definitely consider to be the most controversial Sonic final boss in the entire series, but I can't lie and say I'm not a fan. As fun as getting 5 Super Sonic fights would have been, and while the End technically is one, it's nice to have some variety and keep Super Sonic feeling special, and I honestly thought the final boss was really unique and a genuine challenge compared to the Titans, especially Supreme. The End, on the other hand, is instead a bullet hell minigame with a genuinely really neat mechanic of light and dark shooting modes, which I found to be really neat and added some needed depth to make the fight not feel like a glorified Galaga stage. The End also beats you down verbally the whole way through, adding really nice atmosphere to the fight.
You glitter. You fly about me like a gnat. I am inevitable. I cannot be denied.
It may not be the flashiest final boss ever, but it still felt like a finale, which a final boss should do, even if we didn't really get time to properly build that threat. Overall, the bosses are really solid here and always leave you in a good mood after finishing an island, but there is one other thing that all these boss fights have in common that bleed into every aspect of the game, which of course would be the music. Oh my god, dude. The music on display here is easily some of the best Sonic music we've gotten in a long time. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm certainly a little biased when it comes to the soundtrack, purely due to the fact that the genres being featured are mainly electronic and alt/punk rock, which are two of my favorite genres of all time, and the songs on this soundtrack do an absolutely insane job at making you feel exactly what they want you to feel. And nowhere else is that shown better than during the Titan fights. The music for the Titans are nothing short of just pure hype, basically screaming at you to go off and disassemble this Herculean threat down to its last atoms, featuring just insane breakneck drum beats and just fucking awesome riffs, complemented perfectly by an incredible vocal delivery by Kellen Quinn, one of the biggest names in alternative and punk rock from the late 2000s and early 2010 era. This perfect storm of musicality makes for some of the best boss themes ever in a video game, in my opinion. I really can't stress enough how good these are. Now, on the flip side, the island themes are very slow and melodic, really giving you a sense of wonder and atmosphere to every island, each theme complementing its respective island theme. Finally, we have the Cyberspace stage themes. Each stage got its wholly unique song, and while these tunes are all very electronic focused, they never start to feel stale or samey, and a few of these Cyberspace stages will certainly go down as some of my favorite level themes. My personal favorites have got to be 1-2's Flowing, two 1 Slice and Sway, and 3-2's Ghost Lab. Though I will be honest, some Cyberspace stage themes certainly suffer from feeling forgettable, while others suffer from just being a 2013 Skrillex song, and no, I am not kidding. But I really wouldn't call any of the songs bad. I think overall Frontiers has less standout tracks than the average Sonic game, but the ones that stand out really shine through. And the ones that don't are still incredibly consistent, which makes for one of the most just genuinely enjoyable Sonic soundtracks of all time. Now, before I get to the end of this, I want to talk about one final aspect of the game, something that I never thought I'd have to give this much time and effort to, and that would be the story. Now, for nearly the past 20 years, the story in a Sonic game was never really anything to write home about, but thanks to Sonic Team for actually trying to include a deeper narrative this time around. And with the help of veteran Sonic comic writer Ian Flynn, we got easily one of the most expansive stories since Sonic Adventure 2. Now, if you backtrack to the start of this review, I quickly mentioned the setup for this story with Sonic and friends, as well as Eggman getting sucked into cyberspace, with Sonic being the only one to make it out in one piece, while Eggman becomes fully trapped. Amy, Knuckles, and Tails, on the other hand, becoming stuck stuck in a strange non-physical limbo between realities. But once Sonic begins to reunite with his friends, we start to learn about the Starfall Islands themselves, learning about an ancient civilization called the Ancients and their direct connection to Chaos from Sonic Adventure 1. And the creation of the Chaos Emeralds, which is something that has been really left in a sense of mystery this whole time, so it was nice to get some insight on one of the most iconic features from any Sonic game. We also get some added information on the Titans and their purpose as protectors of the Starfall Islands, as well as learning the purpose of cyberspace, which we learn is actually an interconnected web of information and data with the ability to be accessed by fully corporeal parties. I really had complete faith in Ian and his ability to write good Sonic stories, which he's proven time and time again with IDW, but I found that the story he created for Frontiers often struggled to find room to breathe. Even with 3 hours of cutscenes and roughly 12 to 15 hours of gameplay, a lot of the story elements felt half-baked and lacked the emotional weight it's very clear Ian wanted you to feel. A prime example of this being the End, who is supposed to be a world-ending force on an unfathomable scale, but ultimately it just kind of gets verbally introduced in the last third of the game, and then before you know it, oh shit! I'm fighting a moon, sick. And like I said, while I did enjoy the fight itself, it really felt robbed of any sense of grandeur. And if there's one thing the story does get right, it's how it grows our main cast. 75% of the cutscenes here are just Sonic talking to someone one-on-one, no one around to take the focus, no immediate threat hurrying them along, just two friends having a heart-to-heart and learning more about the strange islands they've found themselves on. And I think Ian really nailed these conversations, if nothing else. It feels like these characters have grown more in this game than they have in the past 5 combined, which was just an amazing breath of fresh air. It was really sweet to see Amy have character traits other than pining for Sonic, and it was a very welcome change considering we've seen her character capable of a lot of stuff, such as in projects like the comic or the Sonic Boom cartoon. We also got to see some really nice chemistry between the two, and while I know this isn't the most popular opinion, I for one really enjoyed the more mature vocal delivery for these two. You can say what you will about Roger, but I always thought that he did a pretty damn good job as Sonic, especially in Boom. However, I will admit I'm certainly biased towards him as he was the Sonic voice actor I grew up with, which is crazy to think he's been doing it for this long. But for the rest of the cast, we see a new voice actor for Knuckles, that being Dave B. Mitchell, who is certainly playing a believable Knuckles. Mike Pollock and Colleen O'Shaughnessy also reprise their roles as Eggman and Tails respectively, although they're more or less doing the same voices they've been doing for a while. Dave B. Mitchell certainly had big shoes to fill with Knuckles, following up such famous lines as,
"What? A ghost?"
and of course,
"Oh no."
So it was certainly nice to see Mitchell really giving these lines his all, especially when Sonic and Knucks are broing it up on Ares.
So hurry up and get me back to normal. Anything to get you away from me.
Mike Pollock definitely gave a more pulled back performance as Eggman, who cares more about leaving cyberspace and taking care of Sage than thwarting Sonic. Colleen, on the other hand, finally getting a more substantial role with Tails outside of the movies, and really getting to flesh out the character while tying up some loose ends and trying to cobble together some sort of future for him out of a very inconsistent past. Which brings me to some of Ian Flynn's more controversial writing decisions, specifically the use of callbacks and flashbacks to previous titles, which I personally thought was fine and added some much needed depth to the overall story of the modern era. But when referencing titles with weaker writing, you also have to deal with those games' weaker stories, and nowhere else is that more clearly illustrated than with Tails' wildly inconsistent characterization over the years. The game certainly tries at tackling this problem and definitely sets Tails on his way to become a bigger and better character. However, I think it might be best to try and tackle plot holes as little as possible going forward, as it ultimately feels unnecessary and instead should be used on making these characters feel more consistent and referencing their pasts when that reference actually helps to reinforce a stable characterization. Frontiers does this fairly well, but it also suffers from some unnecessary nostalgia bait callbacks. Its story is certainly making strides in building up these characters for the future, as well as making them seem more mature and experienced. However, in spending so much time tweaking classic characters, it ends up leaving a very cramped space for the newcomer of the series, Sage, who is Eggman's newest and brightest AI, tasked with helping Eggman escape cyberspace, taking the power of the Ancients for himself, and giving Sonic no information. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Sage is a wonderful addition to the Sonic cast and she certainly tries her best at filling the role given to her, and while it's very clear Ian wanted to give this character some real emotional weight behind her story, but putting your big emotional moment 2 islands before we actually get to spend some real time with her, and accompanying that moment with a crude humming version of a song we don't hear until the end credits, on top of adding footage from cutscenes we've already seen but with a sepia tone filter thrown on, doesn't really elicit a sentimental or sad scene. Instead, it just made me feel confused, and I sat there trying to take it seriously and not laugh, which really isn't the reaction you want from your character had a change of heart scene. This one honestly kind of embarrassing scene aside, when we do actually get some dedicated time for Sage on Arenos, she certainly became a character I cared more about and really want to see more of in subsequent games, especially after the final boss. However, they just don't feel like someone who is given a true arc, unlike the rest of the characters in the game, whose stories actually have beginnings, middles, and ends, even if some of those arcs are stronger than others. I'm looking at you, Sonic, with your "oh no, I'm corrupted," immediately followed by "oh, never mind, I used the power of friendship and I'm fine now. And even though my friends sacrifice their physical forms again, there will be no consequences for this, and we'll all be unscathed by the end." Which I think is a real shame, because Amy, Knuckles, Tails, Eggman, and even Sage leave the Starfall Islands grown and with new ambitions and goals in mind, which leaves for a very open-ended ending, which really hyped me up as to where we'd see these characters go next and what adventures awaited them. In conclusion, I think Frontiers is chock full of a lot of neat ideas that, while maybe not always sticking the landing, or in a few select cases not really landing at all, they still all have good amounts of potential for the future, and I can't think of a single thing in this game, besides the boost gauge, that couldn't be improved or even perfected for a sequel or new game with similar foundation. The music is as consistent as you'd expect for a Sonic game. The boss fights have certainly set a very high standard that I'm really excited to see what they do with next. However, I really don't want to see every boss fight just become a Super Sonic fight, and I definitely want to see some variety going forward with future bosses. But the direction they're going with for the characters is a very welcome change, and I really can't wait to see the main cast act on goals created in Frontiers, not to mention how Eggman and Sage's dynamic may evolve and shift for the future. Frontiers had impossibly giant shoes to fill, and while I think it made a novel effort at that task, it still definitely has a long way to go before the open zone feels perfected, but I do think it's a formula they'll be sticking with for a while, and I for one will definitely be sticking around to see what Sonic Team's next move is with that formula. Thank you everyone for sitting and listening to me ramble about Sonic. If you want to hear more of my insane ramblings, be sure to check out my Twitter over at Nixie, and look out for a more laid-back first-time impressions video on Sonic Adventure 1, which will release sometime next month. Hopefully. Alright, peace.